This is lecture number 1 for History 111 at Northland College. This is lecture number 1A. Every lecture is going to have a number for the day it was given on, and then it's going to have a letter to tell if there's going to be multiple lectures, because I don't want to post one big lecture. So it's going to be broken up into little chunks. This one is going to have 2 chunks, A and B. So this is lecture 1A. This is happening on 8/31/20. And I want to start by starting at the beginning. We're going to talk about human origins. So, human beings evolved quite a while ago. They probably broke away from apes 6 to 7 million years ago, and have evolved on their own a little line after that. And then about 4 million years ago, human beings developed upright posture. They began to basically walk on 2 legs, which freed up their hands to use more tools. And then, 2 million years ago or something in that neighborhood, they started to use tools, right? Stone tools at first, and wooden tools, etc. And basically, once they have this upright posture, biologists give them the name of hominids. And hominids is the group of upright bipedal apes, basically, that we belong to, but it includes lots of other species, right? It includes, Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, but it also includes Australopithecus and a bunch of other species that have gone extinct, right? So we're the only hominids left, but there were lots of them, right? Now, the genus Homo, which is, we're Homo sapiens, we're part of the genus Homo, developed somewhere between 4 million years ago and 1 million years ago. But by 1 million years ago, they were pretty much, the genus Homo was all that's left. So all the other things I'm going to be talking about here are going to be part of that genus of Homo, which is a group of species of hominids. All right, and generally we talk about several species that went extinct, and we emerged out of this. So first there was Homo habilis, and then Homo erectus, and then finally Homo sapiens. Now, Homo sapiens is not quite yet modern human beings. That's actually Homo sapiens sapiens. But this is right, the right ballpark. Now, there's an interesting question that scientists are looking at, which is this debate about monogenesis versus polygenesis. Now, there's no debate that human beings, the Homo genus, evolved first in Africa, right? The African savanna, the wide open grasslands, is where we evolved, right? But when humans began to spread out from Africa, they spread into the Middle East first, and then across Asia, and then up into Europe, and then across to Australia and Americas. I'll talk about that later. But the question is, when did that spread happen, and when did the evolution from habilis erectus Homo sapiens happen? And the two arguments basically go like this. The monogenesis argument argues that, say, Homo erectus evolved in Africa and then spread out into Asia and Europe, etc. And we know, because we have fossils, Homo erectus fossils in Asia and Europe, we know they got there, right? So now you've got Homo erectus spread out everywhere. They're in Africa, they're also in Asia and Europe. But the question is, how did that evolution to Homo sapiens then happen? The two theories are, monogenesis says that Homo erectus in Africa evolved into Homo sapiens, and then those Homo sapiens spread out across Africa and Asia and Europe, and they replaced all the Homo erectus, right? So they were like a new and improved version, Homo 2.0, that went out and replaced and drove extinct all the other Homo species out there, Homo erectus, etc. So there was one origin, monogenesis, in Africa, and they went out and replaced all the previous ones. The other argument, though, is polygenesis. And this is that basically that Homo erectus spread out, but then evolution kept going in all those places. So Homo erectus was evolving in Europe, and Homo erectus was evolving in Africa, and Homo erectus was evolving in Asia. And there was enough interaction between those groups, moving around and running into each other, that they kept interbreeding. And so they were all evolving at the same time. So in this case, Homo erectus didn't go extinct. Homo erectus everywhere, in Europe, in Asia, wherever, evolved into Homo sapiens all at once in sort of a massive evolutionary project that was spread out all over across Africa, Asia, and Europe. The interesting question here is, of course, and we can get into, there's lots of other species of Homo that we have discovered, right? The most famous one is the Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis. And there's a skull discovered in the Neander Valley in Germany, hence the Neanderthal. And for a long time it was thought, and some Neanderthals skeletons are older than Homo sapiens skeletons, right? The Neanderthals emerged about 240,000 years ago, or 225,000 years ago, and they went extinct about 27,000 years ago. Homo sapiens comes along much more like 100,000 to 40,000 years ago. And so they overlapped, but they're different, and Neanderthals eventually went extinct. Well, for a long time there was a debate, right? The monogenesis versus polygenesis was, did Homo sapiens come out of Africa and drive the Neanderthals extinct? Or did Homo sapiens come out of Africa and interbreed with the Neanderthals until there was only one group left that we call Homo sapiens? Well, this debate was finally settled in the last 20 years, because they have managed to extract DNA from Neanderthal bones and compare it to human DNA. And what they found is that lots of human beings have a certain percentage, 1%, 3%, somewhere in there, of Neanderthal DNA, which means that Homo sapiens were interbreeding with Neanderthals, right? We don't get Neanderthal DNA any other way. But it still doesn't settle the debate as to whether or not, for the most part, Neanderthals interbred with Homo sapiens, or whether Neanderthals went extinct. We know there was some interaction, and in fact, as a side note, there was actually a study I saw just a few months ago saying that it looks like a certain people with a certain little snip of DNA might be slightly more. Their body might respond differently to COVID-19 than people who don't have that DNA, and that DNA actually came from Neanderthals. Right? Setting that aside, so we know that Homo sapiens came out of Africa, and we know that somewhere along the line, all these other species of Homo humans basically disappeared. And I want to just mention that in the last 15, 20 years, there's been a number of discoveries of other species of Homo that existed a lot longer than we thought, right? We sort of thought by the time Neanderthals and Homo sapiens were facing off, 100,000 years ago, that all the other species were gone, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, etc. But in fact, they've made discoveries on the island of Flores in the Pacific. They discovered a species of very small people who were a different species than Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, right? They call them Homo floresiensis. And then in Siberia, in a cave, they've discovered bone fragments, and they did DNA analysis, and they realized there's another species, and they call those Denisovans. And so and we're probably going to discover more. So it seems like there were lots of species of human beings running around up until about 40,000 years ago. Right? And in fact, the Homo floresiensis was probably around as recently as like 17,000 years ago. Right? That's a second in evolutionary time. So ultimately, though, human beings emerged. Homo sapiens remained the only species of hominid left. Okay, and so they kept evolving, even though that we were Homo sapiens 100,000 years ago. We're still evolving. And it's probably about 40,000 years ago that Homo sapiens, which is us, existed. So essentially, if you're talking about people from 40,000 years ago to the present, if you look at their DNA, you really can't tell they're any different than us. Right? So they probably looked like us. They were shorter, probably because of diet and things like that. But essentially, they were us. Okay, so about 40,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens exist. Now, the spread is kind of interesting. Obviously, as I said, they emerged in Africa. And in fact, the African savanna, the sort of East Africa, is probably where they emerged first. Humans emerged first, although there have been some discoveries in South Africa recently that make it questionable whether human beings evolved farther south than we thought, but somewhere in East Africa. All right. And then they spread out, and we know, we have examples of human remains in the Middle East, in Israel or in modern day Georgia or Turkey or things like that. So we know they got to the Middle East, and then they spread, and it seems as though there were two major splits. One, they went north into Europe, north and west into Europe, and then the other, they basically went east across what we would today call, Pakistan, Iran, Pakistan, India, etc. And until they got to China, they got to Southeast Asia, etc. Then between certainly by 40,000 years ago, but sometime between maybe 60,000 and 40,000 years ago, humans got to Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, etc. And that was because of low sea levels, right? During the last ice age, there's a lot of water on Earth was in the form of ice, in ice, glaciers and things, and so the global sea levels were actually much lower, and that meant that for somebody traveling into Southeast Asia, they only had a fairly short jump across the ocean to get to Australia, right? Whereas today it's several hundred miles. Then it might have been less than 100 miles, right? And so they certainly always had to have boats. There's no way they could have gotten there without boats, but the distance was much shorter. So we know that maybe by 40,000 years ago, human beings had boats, and they had made to Australia, New Guinea, etc. Then we also know that by 15,000 years ago, they had crossed into the Americas, right? And there's some debate there too about how they got into the Americas. There's one debate is that that when the sea levels were lower, there was a land bridge that basically Russia and Alaska were part of one piece of land, and you could walk. But of course, sea levels were lower because it was the ice age and there were lots of glaciers. And so, the question is, how do you walk across glaciers for months? Where do you get food, etc. So there's been some theories and debate about, were there moments where some of the glaciers had melted, etc. But another theory is that perhaps, actually I should say, the idea there was that they walked through a sort of break in the glaciers, and then they came down what we would call the east side of the Rocky Mountains. A second theory is that they basically moved along the coast, and this theory includes maybe they just did it by boat. Maybe they just rode along the coast, popping in on the coastline periodically to hunt and fish and camp for a while, and then moving farther down. There are proponents for both arguments. They might both be true. But anyway, by 15,000 years ago, human beings had reached the Americas, and it didn't take very long, 5,000 years tops, for them to get all the way to South America, right? So they came in somewhere up by Alaska, and they spread throughout the Americas. So in all this then, human beings now basically populate the Earth. They don't populate Antarctica, but pretty much all the other continents. They don't quite occupy all the Pacific Islands yet, but they occupy all the continents. And throughout this, I just want to make it clear that human beings are essentially hunting and gatherers, right? Hunters and gatherers. This means a couple things. One is that they move in small groups. Usually, it could be as small as 8 to 10 people, maybe as large as 40 or 50. And they probably broke up into smaller groups and reunited into larger groups at various times, and et cetera. But they had to move around, right? Because they're foraging off the land. They're hunting animals who have migration patterns. They are eating plants that have seasonal growth. And so they move from place to place to take advantage of all these different things. And because of that, human beings didn't really develop complex societies, because basically hunting and gathering can only support, it depends on the place, but at most, 5 people or so per square mile, because you got to move around and get food all over the place. And that means low population densities. And because of that, and the fact that they needed low population densities, they tended to break up into small groups and move around a lot. And so you didn't have large groups of people with big hierarchies or anything like that. You didn't have cities because they didn't stay in one place long enough to have cities. You didn't even probably have private property in the sense of houses and land, etc., because they moved, right? And so there was no sense that I own this or you own that. People had personal belongings, right? I made this knife, it's mine, but they didn't own property, right? And there's also some theory that in fact there was they might have been fairly egalitarian in terms of gender, and the reason for that is simply that that without those distinctions of property, without warfare, without all the sorts of hierarchies and things, there really just wasn't a hierarchy at all. So men and women were all basically equal in the group. Now, there was some split in terms of tasks. Because children had to be breastfed, it's probable that women in most of these groups had children with them, although the birth rate was much lower in hunting and gathering societies. But basically women therefore didn't move around as much, and so the hunting tended to be done by men who went on long hunting expeditions to go track game, whereas women tended to do foraging and gathering, etc., and gathering food. Now, the protein in animal game was highly prized, but the majority of calories were produced by gathering, and that means most of the calories were probably produced by women, with the sort of highly prized specialized meat calories provided by men. All of this is speculation. It's based partly on modern, there are still hunting and gathering societies today. It's based partly on, archaeological finds, etc., things like that. But it's not as if we don't have, any writing left from these hunting and gathering societies to tell us how they divided up gender roles. The other thing about these hunting and gathering societies is that they were very dependent on the sort of ecological system, right? They were very aware of what plants bloomed when you could eat them, where things grew, where things didn't grow, where animals moved, where they didn't move, what the life cycle of animals was. They were very aware of all of this, right? And one of the things we're going to see in the next part of the lecture is when you get to the shift to agriculture, the shift to agriculture probably came in part because of pressures on hunting and gathering societies, either from climate change or population growth. And I'll talk about those things, but I just want to make it clear that hunting and gathering societies were in a very delicate balance with their environments, right? They couldn't grow too big population-wise because the land couldn't support that many people. They had to move around a lot. They had to know a whole lot. And that knowledge required, was based on the idea that nothing was changing. But in fact, things like ice ages and climate change happened, and they had to adapt and change their knowledge in that way. So this is the end of Lecture 1A. Lecture 1B will be about the coming of agriculture.